When last we met, I was giving my initial impressions of Metroid Dread, a game 16 years in the making, and at this point the newest game in the Metroid timeline. And I feel like I was generally positive, with the only real issue I took being that of Samus losing and regaining largely the same abilities she does every game. But the further I progressed into Dread, the more something was biting at the back of my mind. You see, I haven't actually played a lot of Metroid games. I've kept up with the series through Let's Plays and reviews, and I own most of the games, so I feel confident in calling myself a Metroid fan, but having gained most of my experience through osmosis, who am I to critique Metroid Dread? So I made a decision. I would go back and review every mainline Metroid game, starting with the original Metroid on the NES. This way, when I get to Metroid Dread, I won't have any doubts about certain elements possibly overstaying their welcome. Plus, I'll be ticking a few games off the old backlog, which is always a plus. But everything I've heard about the original Metroid leads me to believe the game is a clunky and confusing relic of its time, better off skipped over for the remake, or played with a guide. And, yeah, I don't really like following guides when I play a game, because it takes me out of the experience. I want to explore the world, throw the dice, and see what happens. So I decided to approach Metroid the way I would any other game. Jump in blind and see what happens. So then, how far I was able to make it in this guide game? Did I hit that inevitable point where progression just wasn't possible without some sort of outside assistance? No. No, I did not. Let's review. In the year 2000 of the history of the cosmos, a group of representatives from different planets came together in Congress to form the Galactic Federation. The Federation created the first system of intergalactic travel and trade, launching thousands of interstellar spacecrafts, and reigning in a golden age of cultural exchange. But peace never seems to last forever, and with the booming intergalactic trade routes also came the rise of the space pirates, who began to raid and pillage the Federation spacecrafts. In response to these attacks, the Federation establishes a police force to protect their ships, but the space pirates were a formidable foe and proved difficult to track down and capture in the vastness of space. Seeing no other alternatives, the Federation put out a call to the greatest warriors around to come together and hunt the space pirates, capturing them for a bounty. This group would become known as the Space Hunters. The year is now 20x5 of the history of the cosmos, and something disastrous has happened. A Federation research vessel was returning to Earth from the planet SR-388, where an unknown lifeform was recovered. This lifeform was in suspended animation and placed in a capsule for transport. The Federation scientists discovered it's possible to revive the creature and potentially multiply it. The entire civilization of SR-388 was wiped out, and it's strongly believed that this creature the Federation scientists named Metroid was responsible. The space pirates have raided the ship and stolen the Metroid. If they're able to multiply and weaponize the Metroid, they could destroy entire civilizations, putting the whole galaxy at risk. The Federation police force wasted no time in tracking the pirates to the heavily fortified planet Zebes, but the Federation is unable to break through the planet's defenses. Time is of the essence. Every moment the space pirates have the Metroid is another step closer to annihilation. As a last resort, the Federation calls in Samus Aran, the best of the space hunters, with a reputation for completing missions thought to be impossible, and abilities even the space pirates have come to fear. Samus is tasked with finding and destroying the mechanical lifeform Mother Brain, as well as dispatching any Metroids found on the planet Zebes. Proving their reputation was no fluke, Samus is able to infiltrate the pirates' headquarters deep within the surface of the planet. That's quite a setup, covering anywhere from 5 to 95 years. Seriously, can anyone solve for X here? I'm dying to know what the timeline is. But for as deep as the manual goes in setting up the story, the game doesn't do much to add to it. Samus arrives in the space pirates' base with only 30 of 99 health remaining. I like to think of this as the result of Samus' struggles to break into the heavily fortified base, but that's really just conjecture. Samus is able to track down and defeat both Ridley and Kraid, that's the order I fought them in, opening the path to Torian, where it turns out the space pirates successfully replicated the Metroid. The area doesn't have any other life outside of the Metroids, which leads me to believe that this replication came at a cost, but that's also just a guess. Samus is able to defeat the replicated Metroids and destroy Mother Brain, setting a bomb and escaping before the explosion. And while there is an ending screen, I kinda wish there was just a bit more. I get that this was normal for games at the time, but I've always wondered why we couldn't have gotten a few static images with text to give us a proper finish to the story. But enough about the story. Let's talk about our main character. Samus has a reputation of being a stoic badass, and little else. which is too bad because Samus has a lot of personality in the manual. I mean, the badass thing is there, greatest of the space hunters, feared by the space pirates, completes impossible missions, cybernetic superpowers, and that's great and all, but it doesn't really speak to who Samus is. But look at some of these illustrations. Fist raised and ready for action, or maybe making a grand entrance. Doing a dynamic hero pose for the camera. Holding an NES controller? Yes, gamer. A comical head tilt? Maybe just a bit judgmental. Reacting to being partially set on fire. Insert your own hot-ass joke here. Farting out a question mark, and powering up like a Super Saiyan. There's even a cartoony Mega Man-like pose when Samus fires a missile. All of these show off something far more interesting than being a badass. They show off a playful or goofy side to Samus, as well as a general sense of fun. There are hints of hobbies like watching anime or gaming. Gotta do something on those long trips through space after all. And while all of these are assumptions based on cartoonish illustrations, it still does so much more to tell us who Samus is outside of he's a badass. Oh yeah, he. Guess I should address that. Throughout the game's manual, Samus is solely referred to using male pronouns, and the only hint of something amiss is the statement, his true form is shrouded in mystery. And at first I thought this was added for the English translation, because descriptive pronouns are rarely used in Japanese, so it wouldn't be hard to keep things anonymous, but as it turns out, even in the Japanese manual, they use kare, meaning he or him, when referring to Samus. Back in the 80s, games were targeted at a male audience, which is why protagonists were generally male, even if they weren't human. I can only assume that the decision to hide Samus' gender until the end of the game served two purposes. The first being a shocking twist that the player wouldn't have seen coming, and the second would be to test the waters and see how people reacted to playing as a girl. I wasn't one of the people shocked by this revelation because by the time I got into Metroid, it was well known that Samus Aran is a lady girl. But if you were one of the people who got to experience this twist firsthand, let me know how you felt about it in the comments section. But before moving on, there's just one other little thing I have to address. The game's endings. On the end screen, Samus will do one of 5 things determined by how long it took to finish the game. In Ending 5, Samus is turned away from the player with her face buried in her arm cannon, like she's ashamed. I'm telling you, Samus has a playful side. In Ending 4, Samus is facing forward with her fist in the air. Since she's not shaking her fists in anger, I like to think Samus is cheering the player on, encouraging them to do better. In Ending 3, Samus removes her helmet, like she's satisfied enough with this playthrough she's ready to meet face to face. What's important about this ending is that even though we can see her face, thanks to the 8-bit graphics, Samus' gender is still a mystery. In Ending 2, Samus fully removes her armor and waves. The player has done such a good job that Samus can finally relax and reveal her mysterious true form. The tight-fitting leotard-esque outfit leaving no question about said form being feminine, or that this game was designed in the 80s. In Ending 1, Samus strips all the way down to her underwear in order to wave. And yeah, I know they call this a bikini, but it's still less clothing as a reward for doing better at the game. The inclusion of the bikini ending doesn't ruin the game for me, but I really do wish they would have just stopped at Ending 2. Luckily, Samus' skivvies aren't what would go on to define her, and as far as I know, Nintendo never hit her gender again. It goes to show that Samus' exploits stand far and above exploiting Samus, and I'd call that a win. While we're on the subject, Metroid has a number of well-known exploits. None of which I used because I wanted my experience to be as genuine as possible. No maps, no guides, no exploits. And I was ready to have a terrible time. I expected frustrating difficulty, an excessive amount of jank, slippery, poorly aged controls, and difficulty navigating due to overly reused assets. But I never ran into anything that soured the experience for me. Sure, the game is difficult at first, but the more you explore and find upgrades, the easier the game becomes. At the beginning, it doesn't take much damage to put Samus into dire straits, but by the end, she can casually stroll through magma without a care in the world. Most enemy behavior is easy to learn and work around, and while it's true that enemies can hit Samus while she's going through a door, all you have to do to prevent this is not go through a door while an enemy's coming at you. All in all, when speaking about difficulty, I feel like the game's pretty well balanced. As to how janky the game is, I really didn't notice anything during my playthrough except getting stuck in the magma here. But that's not really the game breaking in any way, it's just the strange properties of the magma. If I had stopped pressing buttons, Samus would have sunk to the floor and I could have escaped. It's not good design by any measure of the word, but it's not game breaking or even unfair. Generally, one wants to avoid pools of molten rock, so the fault is mine, for several reasons. Control-wise, Samus is a little floatier than I'd like, but it doesn't take long to acclimate to, and the game is designed around how Samus controls. The only time when her floaty jumps are noticeable are when jumping onto small platforms, like the ending sequence, which goes on just a little long for my taste. But even then, it's doable. It may not be the buttery smooth control of Metroid Dread, but it works just fine for what it sets out to do. The biggest obstacle I expected was navigation. So how did I manage not to get lost? Well, the short answer is that I did get lost, but it wasn't a bad time. I'm going to go against the grain here and say Metroid for the NES has good level design. The game is divided into 5 areas, those being Brinstar, Kraid's Lair, Norfair, Ridley's Lair, and Torian. Each of these areas have their own set of assets and room types, making navigation just a bit easier. You don't have to memorize the entire map. You just have to learn the area you're currently in. And while some room layouts can be similar to others, the elements of the rooms are unique enough to differentiate them. Yes, you will get lost, but that's kind of the point. Zebes is a maze. You're supposed to hit dead ends and make wrong turns, but in doing so, you'll learn the layouts of the areas and find hidden goodies. I love it when a game rewards player for exploring, and Metroid has that in spades. Some paths lead to power-ups or items, others lead to dead ends or traps. This makes exploration exciting because you never know what you're going to find or if it will be safe. But you're not completely on your own either. The game does a lot to prepare the player for the challenges ahead. Don't believe me? Allow me to prove it. As I mentioned earlier, Samus only starts out with 30 health. Story assumptions aside, this is done so when the player gets health from defeating enemies, they'll see Samus can become stronger than she was when the game started, while also learning how to farm for health. If the player heads to the right, standard side-scroller fare for back in the day, eventually they'll reach a wall with a low passage, blocking progression and forcing the player to backtrack until they've gone past the starting point to where they'll find the Morph Ball, which is what they need to bypass this narrow passage. And in this short amount of time, the game has given the player loads of information. Samus can interact with some objects by shooting them. Exploration is going to be a large part of progression. There are hidden or blocked routes, and Samus will get new abilities to get past obstacles. Let's talk about obtaining the Morph Ball for a minute. When Samus gets a health drop, the effect is immediate. A little boop noise plays, and Samus's health recovers. But when Samus gets the Morph Ball, a triumphant tune plays. You know the one. And then nothing happens. Samus is just trapped here until she masters her new ability. This should incentivize players to try out new things whenever they hear the tune. Next, I want to talk about this room right here. This room is important. Assuming the player will follow the route I just mentioned, Samus will pass through this room 3 times. Notice there are cracked blocks on the floor, and underneath we can see some enemies crawling around. There are pillars made of these same cracked blocks in nearby rooms, which should entice players to try shooting them, but in case the players don't take the hint, there's also a zoomer right there just begging to be blasted. Either way, the player will now know that some blocks can be broken. The passage under these blocks leads to Kraid's Lair, but to get there the player will need to find missiles to open red doors and bombs to get through the cracked floor since Samus can't aim down. Now let's take a look at this fellow here. This is a Ripper, and it is invulnerable. What stands out is the noise that tells a player damage isn't being done. So if they hear this same noise from, say, a door, then it's clear that what the player's doing is ineffective. And speaking of doors, this red door here also has a lot of knowledge to impart. As stated previously, these doors need to be opened using missiles, which the game visually hints by having the green highlight turn blue when Samus equips her missiles. It takes 5 missiles to open, which might seem excessive, but it's the game teaching the player that sometimes 1 missile isn't enough. Like with, say, Metroids. By the time the player reaches Kraid's Lair, which the game nudges them toward, they will have all the knowledge needed to finish the game. But if all that still isn't enough, the game manual has a large number of helpful hints for the player, including a controller diagram showing every button and its function, an explanation of the on-screen elements, directly telling the player to shoot the walls and bomb the environment to look for secret paths, a mini-map and basic layout of where all the areas are located relative to each other, what kind of terrain and enemy resistance Samus will face in those areas, and which mini-bosses in which area. Detailed information on all the enemies in the game, including how to defeat Metroids and Zebatites, boss strategies for both Kraid and Ridley, and a pretty big hint of how to defeat Mother Brain. There's also a breakdown of every power-up and ability Samus can get. Actually, let's discuss Samus's abilities in this game and see how they're used. The Morph Ball allows Samus to pass through narrow passageways. Bombs are used well in the Morph Ball and can kill enemies or break blocks on the ground and in narrow passageways. The Long Beam increases the range of Samus's arm cannon. The Wave Beam increases the power of the arm cannon and hits a wider area, but can't be used with the Ice Beam. The Ice Beam freezes enemies on contact, which can be used as platforms, and is required to finish the game, making the Wave Beam kind of useless. The High Jump increases Samus's jump height by 25%, the Varia Suit reduces damage by 50%, the Screw Attack allows Samus to kill enemies by jumping into them, Energy Tanks permanently increase Samus's health by 100, there are 8, but Samus can only carry 6, Missile Tanks increase Samus's missile reserves by 5, and there are 21 of them. When starting out, Samus can run, jump, shoot halfway across the screen, and has a maximum of 99 life. By the end of the game, her jump is higher, and can kill most enemies while spinning through the air. Her shots travel the entire screen and freeze enemies. She has 255 missiles, can drop bombs while rolling around on the ground, has 699 life, and takes 50% less damage. This is the Samus Aran that the space pirates fear. Look, Metroid isn't a perfect game. It's also not a guide game, not a broken game, and not a poorly designed mess. It's a masterfully crafted maze that challenges a player's observation skills and ability to think outside the box. And as far as I know, it was the first game of its kind, mixing the platforming elements of Mario with the exploration of Zelda. It's also a game meant to be played more than once. Sure, on your first playthrough it might take 8 to 10 hours, but each successive time through the game will be quicker, especially with the powered-up Samus you get as a reward for finishing the game. Gamers, there's 5 endings for a reason. When I decided to play Metroid blind, I was completely convinced that it was only a matter of time before I would become so lost that I would have no other choice but to look up the answer. It was a foregone conclusion that I would become part of an echo, repeating what so many others have said about the game. But that's not what happened. Not at all. Look, if you want to play Metroid to cross it off a list, just to say you've played through all the Metroid games, then sure, whatever, go get a map and a guide and have at it. But you're missing out. Playing through Metroid as intended is fun and rewarding, and I cannot recommend it enough. Sure, your mileage may vary, but by not even giving it a try, you're being robbed of something as simple as forming your own opinion.